Hi, everybody, and welcome to our English for the Workplace Facebook Live broadcast. Sorry we're a little late in starting. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Technical problems, as so often happens. Anyway, I'm joined today by David, the lead educator on the course. Hi, David.
Hello, everyone.
And Sally, another educator on the course.
Hello.
And what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, answer some of the questions that you've asked on the course about, obviously, English for the workplace. Mm-hmm. And then while we're answering those, I hope that you can add more questions in the comments, and we'll try to answer as many as we can over the next half hour or so. So let's just begin with a little summary of what we've been doing so far this week. David, what's been happening?
Well, week one is very much about looking and applying for jobs. And we've had a look at different expressions you can use when writing CVs or writing cover letters. We've had quite a bit of work towards the end of the week. I don't think everyone's got there yet, but it's very useful when they get there about how to write your CV and also about cover letter, which I think is new for many people. So I think a very useful and practical week.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure we'll have lots of questions coming in about CVs and cover letters today, because it's something that we get a lot of questions about on Facebook regularly anyway. Okay, so as I mentioned, let's begin by taking a look at some of the questions that we've already been asked. And I'm going to start with a question from Ainur Majanova. And Ainur's saying, what do employers usually look for in potential employees? Are there any common things, despite the fact that, of course, jobs can be different? And, related to that, then Nadia Konoval was also asking, what do you think people think is more important? Things like their English qualifications for an international company, or to answer the questions well and talk about their experience? So really, let's just talk about that. Are there some kind of general traits and characteristics that will make you more employable? David, would you like to start with that?
Is it okay if I just say yes?
It's a good start.
It's a good start, yes. Well, as the person I think has indicated it, obviously different jobs will need slightly different skills or qualifications. And I think that's the first step before you apply, is have a look at the description of the job and think quite critically about yourself. Do you really fit that position? Because if you apply for a job that, to be honest, you don't have qualifications or experience for, your chance of getting the job is very, very low. So I think that's one thing just as a starting point. And then the second thing I think was more related to maybe in the interview, the second part of the question, or the second part of the question. I think I think unless it's a job where English is the most important skill, such as an English teacher like we are, they're not exclusively judging you on your ability to use English. It needs to be sufficiently good that if you are asked to do a task in English, you can manage it, if that's relevant to the job. And I don't think it's about jargon. I mean, there might be certain technical words that you need in a particular job. I'm teaching some people at the moment who work in the bank, so obviously it's useful if they know some financial words. But I think just putting words in to sound intelligent, shall we say, doesn't necessarily work. I think it's more about the quality of your characteristics, your personality, and your general experience.
And Sally, what would you say? Some general common characteristics, perhaps, that employees would look for. Some of the things that are always a plus if you can demonstrate them. What would you say?
Well, to add to what David just said, which is really good advice, I think one thing that people look for is enthusiasm. So if you're enthusiastic in your, I suppose I'm talking about the actual interview now. If you're enthusiastic, that's going to go a long, long way. And also in terms of English, I think, especially when you're at an interview, the focus is going to be on communication. So even if your English isn't perfect, the interviewer wants to know that you can communicate. So you can make mistakes, as long as you can communicate well. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think what David said is very important there. Unless English is like the key part of the job, where it's one of the core skills that you need to perform the job, and it's perhaps dealing with the public or something in written or spoken English, then yeah, as you say, it's much more important to focus on communicating and getting across your skills and your character and your enthusiasm, as you say, than worrying about making mistakes too much. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our second question. We have a question from CC Zhao, and it's very appropriate based on what David was just talking about, the people he's teaching at the moment. CC Zhao is saying, how can I cope with the fear of speaking English on the telephone? I had difficulties talking to the staff of a British bank's customer service hotline. Are there any tips to prepare for a scenario like this? Now, before I go over to David for this, let me just say, I have had thousands of problems in dealing with customer service hotlines in English as well. So it's not only you. But okay, yes. David, what tips can we give for people to prepare for telephone English in their work?
Well, I think the word in your question is one of the key ones, which is prepare. Because I think a lot of telephone conversations, and if this is specifically about calling a helpline or customer service, these are things that you know what you want to say, and or at least you can think about it in advance. It's not spontaneous, or at least not the beginning of the conversation. So think about what you want to say. If you don't already know how to say that in English, then obviously, check. You can search on the internet. Maybe you can use some translation tools if necessary. Perhaps you have some reference material already on the subject if necessary, and prepare what you want to say. But also, I think you can think about what are the types of questions they might ask you. Because there are some very typical questions that might come in those scenarios where they might, some of them very basic, like wanting to know checking your name, maybe some details so they know you really are who you are claiming to be. Because there's obviously security questions, which might involve spelling your name, numbers. So if you're not confident in that, prepare it. And also certain details about your problem or the thing you want helped with that they are likely to ask you for more information from. So I think, first of all, I do agree with what you're saying. It's not always just a question of, is English your first language? It can be very stressful, this type of conversation. But if you think about it in advance, you can really help yourself.
So basically, yeah, so rehearse, practice the questions, think about what questions might ask you, practice. Okay. And Sally, what about just general telephone English? Because we got a lot of people asking about this who are quite worried, and I know this is a problem. I've had many students with this situation as well.
Yeah.
Face-to-face, they have no problems in communicating, but they find telephone conversations very stressful.
Yeah.
Any suggestions for how to practice that or how to improve that skill?
Well, I know I have this same problem with conversations like this in Spanish. And I've been learning Spanish for years. I've lived in Spain for years, but still sometimes you don't have the physical help. You can't see the person. So it gets confusing. I mean, one thing that I know that I often get asked when I'm on the phone is my phone number. And I know my phone number really well in English, but don't know it so well. So I've it written down next to me, and anything like that that's useful, I've got it written down so that I can say it more easily when I'm on the phone. I think one thing that's quite a good idea is to make notes. I think David, you've already mentioned that. But another thing is that you might have to ask people to repeat what they've said.
Yes.
So I think it's a good idea to prepare how you're going to say that. Even nobody wants to ask repeatedly, can you say that again, please? Can you say that again, please? But if you have some expressions that you can use to ask people to repeat, I think that's helpful. And then at the end or at stages during the conversation, you can paraphrase the information. So for example, say, so the meeting is in room 3 on Friday at 7:00, just to check that you've got the information. And if you do that throughout the conversation, then at the end, then you know that you've got all the necessary information that you need.
Yes, and I think connect to what you're saying, Sally, you can also ask people just to pause a moment so you can make notes. So that, I think that's a very natural and polite thing to do.
Yeah.
Because again, if it was face-to-face, the person can see your writing information. They will probably naturally pause in that kind of scenario. But It's perfectly correct and polite to ask someone, sorry, can you just wait a moment? I need to write this down. So
and I hadn't thought about it until you said that, but I have actually done that in the past myself. When I've had like a difficult meeting with a teleconference meeting with a lot of information to remember, I've actually put it up on Post-it notes, behind on the wall in front of me, so I didn't have to like look through lots of pieces of paper looking for information while I was doing it, and it really worked. It helped a lot. So just some key figures up there and key things that were there written up, as Sally said, it really does help. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, moving on to our last kind of pre-question here. It's from Om Kapoor, and it will lead us into some of the live questions. Om Kapoor would like to ask 2 questions. Number 1, how to prepare a strong CV. So we'll just give a quick summary, I think, of some of the top tips that we talked about this week. And more importantly, I think, the do's and don'ts for the tell me about yourself part of the interview, which everyone, I think, finds stressful. And as Om Kapoor says, this is scary as well as tricky. So let's begin with you again, David. Let's just talk about the general CV tips. We have another question in more detail in a moment, so just a kind of introduction.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is just to keep it relatively short and simple. I think some people write extremely long CVs, several pages, and I think general rule is nobody will read that. Keep it quite short, ideally 1 page, maximum 2. Keep it relevant, direct, factual information is always required. Your job history, your education is definitely required. I think there's some debate about photos. Some countries this is expected, some countries not. I think if you are including a photo, make sure it's a nice one. Looks professional. Sorry, I forgot what the second part of the question was. It was
the second part of the question was about the tell me about yourself question in interviews.
But I'd let Sally try that one first.
Yeah, Sally. Tell us about yourself.
Tell us about yourself in 1 minute.
Well, this is for me. This is the worst part of the interview. The worst part, because I don't know. I think it's partly a cultural thing, but I think it's just a thing for people in general. Maybe especially for women, that it's really hard to sell yourself to say how great you are. So I think basically you need to talk about yourself, but talk about the things that you've done. So the things that you've done and why that makes you suitable for the job.
Yes.
But what you need to do is give good examples. So if you don't want to say, I am an organized person, but if you do say that, you need to back that up. You need to give some evidence and say, because the example that I've done is I organized blah, 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 and then explain what you've done. Recently, I just saw a TED Talk video that we can put the link to afterwards. Sure. I can't remember her name now. It was an American woman talking about, basically she was talking about how you can fake it till you make it.
Basically. I saw that as well, yes.
Right, and it's really good. And she's talking about being confident, basically. And a lot of this is practice. So I strongly recommend that you practice before, specifically for this part of the interview, because if you find this hard, but basically if you need to have confidence, or you need to pretend that you're confident.
Yeah, and as we mentioned there, I mean, talking about the previous question, this is something that you can prepare and practice in advance.
Yeah.
A lot of interview questions, you have no idea what they're going to ask you, and some of them can be very strange. We'll share some of those next week, I think. But, there's some questions that can really throw you because they're bizarre questions. But this is something that is one of the most popular interview questions in the world. And there's a very good chance it will come up. And so, like you say, you can talk about it, you can prepare yourself, you can think of the highlights of your experience and how you can sell that in the best way possible.
And I think sorry to interrupt. No, I was just thinking about one job interview that I had, and I had prepared this bit about myself. So, but they said, so tell us about why you want the job and tell us about yourself. And I thought, oh God, why do I want the job? I can't remember. I knew that I wanted the job. But so that's something that you need to think about, how you're going to explain why you want the job, as well as talking about yourself.
You know what my next question has to be? Did you get the job? Okay, let's move on from there. Let's move on from there. Okay.
I just wanted to add one thing to that, which I think we've mentioned it indirectly, which is it's all about professional skills, that question. It's not about, I'm married, I have 7 children.
Exactly, yeah.
It's about, and all the examples Sally gave and you as well, Neil, I think have kind of said that, but not explicitly, and I think that's important. It's not a personal story.
I think what you said earlier is very important as well. Is there's no point, there's no advantage, there's no benefit in saying I'm hardworking or I'm organized, because it doesn't mean anything to the interviewer. They might hear 20 people say that, and it doesn't make just to describe yourself in adjectives like that doesn't help.
You need examples, don't you? I think one thing I agree with what everybody's said so far. But sometimes I think you can transfer skills from, for example, from things that you do at home if you don't have experience. Sure. So you might mention your family in the fact that something like that you organise everything for the family, or that you look after somebody's children, that kind of thing, but only in the context of how that's relevant for your job.
Yes. Yeah.
No?
And just to wrap up on Om Kapoor's questions before we go to some of the live questions, something else that David said earlier about keeping it short. He wasn't joking when he said that they won't read it. It's funny, but it's true. I think there are statistics that show that, the average time spent reading a CV is only like 2.5 or 3 seconds. It's really just a case people glance at it and they put it to one side and then they look back at the ones they're interested in. But the first look is nothing. So a 12-page CV is not going to do you any favors. Okay, so we've got lots of live questions coming in. We've got people from Myanmar, from Peru, from Thailand, from Ukraine, Sweden, Vietnam, Brazil. Too many people to mention at the moment.
Wow.
Let's begin with Jose Luis's question from Peru. He's asking a very specific question about the CV, and he's asking about the CV format. What's the ideal CV format in terms of layout, and also the use of tenses, which is an interesting question, because there are different ways to do this. But in terms of when you're describing your skills, experience, and so on in the CV, what tense should you use within that? Okay. So who wants to jump in with that one first?
Well, I think in terms of format, I think some people spend a long time trying to make their CV look very attractive with different fonts, different colors. I think for the average person, this is not very important. I think it needs to be very clearly set out. I can think of a couple of examples of people mentioned in, I think, the previous course where their job as a graphic designer or something like that, and actually making their CV look attractive was a selling point of the job. Look, I can do this. But for the average person, it just needs to be very clearly personal details, education, employment history, etc. And I don't think, unless you've got really excellent computer skills, I wouldn't spend too much time actually putting it together and trying to add those details, beautifying it, shall we say.
And in the course, we do give samples and examples of this, and we can give more under the video here and on the step. There are different formats, different layouts, and so on. Whether you have the information at the left-hand side and different indents and stuff like that, it's really up to you which one works best.
Yes.
But we'll share some articles that maybe give you the tips, and of course on the course we have
there is also a danger there if you try too hard that the person receiving it can't read it because their computer maybe is not so up to date or whatever. So I think it's kind of sounds funny, but I think it does happen that if you try too hard, it makes more problems than you solve.
Get someone to check it as well. That's a really big thing, because you might have made a spelling mistake or just missed out a bit of vital information.
Yeah. I think that's very important for the cover letter and CV. Any mistake is potentially fatal to your hopes and dreams. So definitely,
especially if you get the name of the company wrong.
Jose Luis was also asking, about the use of tenses, and
Yes.
I think that's something that maybe we won't go into just now because there's a bit more for that. We'll include some details for that. But yes, there are guidelines for how you should construct the sentences and, what to begin with and so on. And again, not to say I'm hardworking, but to focus on action verbs, things like established, led, directed, created, things like that. So we'll share some resources on that. Okay, our next live question is from Yarina Nipyevoda from Ukraine. The question, this is a very good question from Yarina. I apologize, Yarina, for my pronunciation. The question I'm interested in, what is more appropriate during the interview? Use gender neutral or gender sensitive language? What would we say about that? My feeling on that is I always try to go for gender neutral language in this and avoid any gender specific kind of terms when dealing with this. Sally, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I agree with that, Neil. Although that's not always that easy in English, is it?
No, we lack a pronoun. It's true.
So, I mean, what a lot of people do instead of saying he or she is we say they.
Yeah.
And I know there's some kind of debate about whether that's actually correct or not, but it is what people do.
Yeah. I'm 100% on the side of not only is it correct, but it goes all the way back to Shakespeare, and then Jane Austen uses it, and everyone else.
Okay, well there you go.
They, their, them is the way to go, rather than saying he and she, or in many languages I know people. We used to say in English he, for example, as a general term.
Yeah.
Just avoid those would be my recommendation.
Yeah.
I think I find it particularly odd when a woman uses he when they mean he or she. So I was saying, you're a woman. At least if you're going to choose one, choose she. But I agree with what you said about they. I think it's the solution. Yeah.
Okay, and we've got one specially for David here, because we haven't actually mentioned yet where we're speaking from. But I'm speaking from Bratislava in Slovakia. Sally is in Barcelona in Spain, and David, where are you?
I'm in Bucharest in Romania.
And we have a question from Bianca Elena Paun from Romania, who's asking, do you have any tips on how to find the perfect job? So job hunting, before we get to the stage of CVs, cover letters, or interviews. Do we have any tips on what the best ways are for this, David?
So the looking for the job, finding the job
searching,
advert.
Yes.
Well, I think it might depend exactly on the kind of job you want, because there are a lot of professions will have dedicated websites. And if you know what, obviously you should know yourself what kind of job you're looking for, and then search for websites connected to those. I'm obviously not an expert on every profession, but in teaching, there are some very clear and simple ones you'll find very quickly if you search, teaching jobs in English, for example. And I think that's nowadays with the internet, that is probably the easiest way to do it. Just get online and search.
Yeah. And
carry on.
Sorry. What I was going to say was, actually, my mind's gone blank now. I did have something to say.
That's right. Just interrupt me, then say nothing. That's good.
I forgot. You talk, Neil, and I'll remember what it was.
No, I was going to say, I mean, if, as David says, the places to look, definitely, I think there are a lot of good resources for that now. But I think if you're not sure also about what kind of job you want, I think it's good to maybe sit back and just reflect and make a list of what you like doing, what your skills are, what your experiences are, things like that. And just instead of thinking, I want this kind of job, or this is the job I want, or this is what I can do, try to just take a step back and think maybe there are more things you can do. Maybe if you look at the different skills and experience you've got, maybe you can start looking at things that you've never done before, but there's no reason that you can't try. And I think sometimes that happens. People, I've with some of my friends personally, I've known this. Their job applications have been very narrow. They've applied for only one or two types of jobs, and that's it. And other people apply for jobs that are completely out of the blue, something they've never done before, and it leads to a whole new path and a whole new career. So maybe that. So Sally.
No, I've remembered. It's come back to me now. What I was going to say was, don't just wait until you see job adverts as well. So apply if you've got it very clear in your mind what job you want, and specifically which place you want to work, then write to that company or phone the company or email them.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think if you have friends in the area you're looking for, they will, if you don't personally know where to look, they will probably be able to help and advise, because if you already work in a particular profession, you should know where the jobs are advertised. That's
true. Word of mouth, and also social media is very useful for this as well. We have, I know locally here in Bratislava, we have a number of Facebook groups where people constantly kind of mention, there's a job opening in my company, or we're looking for this, and rather than the kind of more formal ways that can really be a useful path. Okay. Someone just unpinned the question I was about to ask, so I have to go back to it. Okay, question from Liuda Cern, who's talking, and this is something I think we can talk about a little bit, who's saying, CV, no problem. CV is taken care of, but cover letter, what are the things to think about in a cover letter? And I'll just start by saying that, I think what David said earlier is true. Your CV is quite short, and you can go into the details of it and expand on that during an interview if you get an interview. But a cover letter for me is the most important part as well, because that's where you really sell yourself, as Sally was talking about earlier, and put the experience. So, David, what would you say would be the most important things to think about in a cover letter?
Well, I think as you said, it's a chance to sell yourself. And I think the first step is actually look at what the job advertised has asked for. And once you've identified, let's say, 2 or 3 key things in the job, those are things you want to mention in your cover letter. And it's similar to the, tell me about yourself question. Mention those details, but also how you have those skills or those qualifications or whatever it is you think is important. I mean, I would say you don't want to make the letter too long. You don't need to go into every single detail why you're the perfect person for the job. But let's say 2 or 3 key details about the job as you understood it, and how your experience, your skills, as Sally said earlier, maybe your experience is not always professional, but you have something relevant to the job and makes you a very good candidate. So that someone reads that and thinks, wow, this is the person we want. Let's get them in for an interview.
Yeah. And I'd say as well, CVs, a company, if you're advertising a job, you might get 100 CVs and 70 of them may be almost identical. Same qualifications, same kind of level of experience. Maybe they've asked for 5 years. Everyone's got 5 years. Everyone's got the same qualification. It can be a bit difficult just from a CV to stand out. A cover letter is your chance to really show yourself as a person.
Yeah, okay. I think it gives you. It's the part of the job application where you can actually show a little bit more of your personality, isn't it?
Yeah.
More than in the CV.
And I think it's also an area where you really show awareness of the job, which is sort of what I was saying, maybe didn't make it clear enough. But also just small details sometimes, like knowing the name of the person you're writing to, which shows that you've made a little bit of effort to find out, you've checked some details. Sometimes very small things just make you stand out, and it's worth the effort of checking those.
Okay, good. And of course, as we have a lot of information on this on the course, and we'll share some more as well with this. Okay, good question from Magna. And Magna is saying, I live in Australia and I come from Syria. Do I need to change my resume each time I apply for a job according to the job ads? Simple answer to that, yes, but like a little. Some, but would anyone like to say a bit more about that?
I think, is that I think basically yes, as you said, the answer is yes. Your CV has to fit the job that you apply for. I think, well, what I do, for example, I've got my general CV, and then if I apply for a job, I change my CV according to the job.
Yeah.
But I think you really do need to change it depending on what the job is that you're applying for. Is the simple answer.
Yeah.
I mean, you obviously can't change what jobs experience you had or what qualifications you've got, but you could highlight particularly skills, I think.
Yeah.
And I think also goes back to the cover letter, the previous question, where you can really emphasize those differences in the cover letter.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, you can take things out, you can add parts in. I mean, as you say, education, for example, is probably not going to change, but how much you emphasize different parts of it might be different, or even where you place it in the CV might be different. So there are things to go with it. Okay. Let's move on. I apologize for this. Okay. This question is from Nguyen Quinn from Vietnam. And basically the question is, what are the opportunities for people who have graduated from university? So I think the question here is really about when you don't have work experience, when you're looking for the first job. What are the things to think about there?
Well, I think we've all had that experience when we have just either left school or left university, and you're thinking, well, I'd love to do all these jobs, but nobody will let me do it. I think I can give a personal example, actually. I actually volunteered and worked in a charity shop in Britain when I first left university, which doesn't have obvious connection to working as an English teacher, but I think it did, in the sense that there were certain skills I could demonstrate. First of all, the fact that I was some very basic things, like you're willing to get out of bed and go to work every day. You're reliable. It's a very simple example of being reliable. And then there are certain skills I learned in the job, and I actually started training some of the other newer employees, which I think, again, is a skill that if you don't have full-time paid employment, these are kind of skills you can build up in other areas of. So, for example, voluntary work, as I've been talking about, is a very good example, I think, of something you can do.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you also, when you are at that stage of your life, you're probably very young, you're quite young, and enthusiastic, and those like are two things, just like us, just like we were, just like we are. Sorry, yes. No, but those are things that are really, really important, and you can sell those skills. Skills, they're not skills. Sell those characteristics.
I guess,
Yes.
Okay. I have a couple of very short questions I'm going to go through very quickly here because they're good questions, but I think they just need short answers. First question from Luis Eduardo Castro Gonzalez from Colombia is saying, is it okay in an interview if I ask the person to speak more slowly because I can't understand, or would this be a negative point in my interview? What would we say to that?
I think goes back to what we said before. Unless English is the key skill of the job, I don't see this as a problem at all.
I'd agree with that. Sally, do you agree?
Yeah. No, I think that's good. Yeah.
They're more interested in your skills and your ability to do the job, perhaps. And so if by speaking more slowly they can find that information out, it will help. Okay.
Probably just if you think that might be a question they're going to ask, think how you can say that so that it sounds okay. Like, could you repeat that more slowly?
Okay. Next short question from Asal Ahmadlo from Melbourne. When the interview is finished, is it important to send a thank you email to the interviewer? Now, that's an interesting one. What are your feelings on that? This I think, could be a cultural question, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it depends where you are. But I don't think it can do any harm. So if you're not sure and you think it's a nice thing to do, why not?
I think it could depend a lot on the type of job as well. I mean, I can see that, if you're applying for a job in perhaps a small family-run company or something where there's a small group of people, it would be a nice touch. I think if it's like a global, multinational, massive office where they're seeing 100 people that day, it might not be. But
On the other hand, it might make you stand out. So I think it can go both ways.
Yeah, it might.
So I think it's really... It's up to you and maybe the traditions or the expectations of the country you're in.
Yeah, I've never done it. I mean, maybe that explains a lot about my career.
No, I've never done it, and I just thought I don't know the answer to that question, but then
me neither.
That's a nice thing to do, isn't it? And it might be
it could be,
I have experienced it when people have done it for jobs where I've interviewed people, and I thought it always came across as a nice touch that they were thankful you're taking the time to interview them.
Yeah.
Okay, another very short, very simple question from Razik Samun. What's the difference between a CV and a resume?
Isn't it British and American English, basically?
Yeah, that's really all there is to it. Yeah, same thing. I think resume is actually becoming more common in British English as well now.
Yes.
It's quite recent, but yeah, basically in British we say curriculum vitae and CV. In American English it's always resume, I think. And that's okay. Very interesting question here from Tetiana Kapinus, who's saying, what do you think about a video CV? Now, that is an interesting question. I know you mentioned earlier about some design careers and so on, and certainly in some tech companies and web design companies and so on, and various social media things. Video CVs are becoming, or are a thing. Again, it's something I have no personal experience of. What are your thoughts on it?
You're making me feel old with this question, Neil, because I'm just thinking this sounds like such a young person's thing to do, and I've never even thought about it.
Not me, Tetiana, you're making David feel old, okay?
Hey, no, it's you, Neil. Your specific comment.
I'm very intrigued.
Tatiana was merely inquiring our professional knowledge.
Does Tatiana say which kind of job?
No,
just out of interest. Okay.
No, but I have.
No, I think that might be the key thing. What is the job? Yeah.
But
sorry, Karen.
No, it's a new thing to me. But I mean, we're here on Facebook making a video, basically, aren't we? So this is what happens these days. I don't know if we've got any advice. I mean, we have advice for people making videos.
Yeah, I think we'll look into that, because when I was in Asia, I did see advertisements for companies who would create your video CV, and it is I know that it is used in certain careers, but it's very unusual.
I think if it complemented a more traditional approach, it certainly can't be wrong, can it? Because the worst case scenario is the person will ignore it. But if they've got all your information in the more traditional paper format, shall we say, or electronic format, then there's just one more thing that makes you look different.
I'm going to go completely off topic now. Okay, this
for a change.
This is not a question directly related to English for the workplace, but it's an interesting question, and we don't get so many questions from China. So I do want to ask this one from Leon Zhang, who says hello from China. Leon wants to ask. He says, "I hope the question is not offensive, but do native British English speakers need to learn standard English in school? Because some accents are very difficult for non-native English speakers to follow." And Leon has colleagues from Liverpool in Scotland. So this question really applies in week 4 of the course, I think, is where that would come up as the most important thing. But I have colleagues from Liverpool in Scotland, and having a meeting with them is a nightmare for me. We're from Scotland, so sorry about that, Leon. But yes, it's a good question.
We're not all from Scotland.
Well, close enough.
Well, we're all from the UK, shall we say? I think Sally was trying to indicate that she's not. Yeah,
I'm not from Scotland.
Fine.
But we all have what would be called regional accents.
Yes.
But we're all English teachers, or we have been English teachers.
Yes.
And I think the question was, do we have to learn standard English at school? And no, we don't learn standard English at school. And at school, generally, we just talk with the accent we have in that region. But in class, we modify a little bit our accent if we have a strong accent for teaching in class, but still we have an accent.
I mean, it's an interesting thing, because I've worked with many companies, many large international companies in dealing with their staff, and for me, it's most people, everyone, I think, everyone can speak their dialect and their accented English and standard English, or a form of standard English, and I think it's a question of consideration. I think that if you're dealing with someone in another country, you should try to modify your language and speak as close to standard English as you would want to, and avoid other things. But I have been in many, many meetings where this has not been the case. not just from British people, but from people in different areas. What do you think? Because I mean, it's an interesting question because it makes people like Leon feel self-conscious, like their English perhaps is not good enough, and that may not be the problem. David?
Well, I agree with your last point. I think very often when people feel inadequate in their English because they can't communicate with native speakers, I think it's actually quite a reasonable point to say sometimes it's the fault of the native speaker, not the learner, because there is a tendency to use lots of slang or colloquialisms or to speak too fast, even just as simple as that. Yeah. And I actually think it would be really useful in many large international companies, just as they offer English classes to their workers, is, have 1 or 2 sessions for native speakers on, these are things that your employees will never understand. These are things they would understand, because there are different ways of saying the same thing. And as Sally said at first in answering this, because we're English teachers, we're aware of that. And hopefully you can understand, if not every word we have said in this broadcast, then the majority of the words, because we know how to speak to people. Or maybe I'm being optimistic there, but I hope I'm not.
We try.
We're doing our best,
don't
least,
we? We try.
I was trying very hard there, David, but I just couldn't catch it. So.
Come on. We'll tell the truth. We're from the same town. If we cannot understand each other, there is no hope.
Okay.
But sometimes native English speakers sometimes panic when they talk to somebody who doesn't speak English, who doesn't speak English like they do, because we're not very good at basically at learning other languages, and we're not used to the whole language thing in general. And so sometimes people panic and they forget to speak clearly and maybe not so language aware as people who use more than one language in their daily life.
And another thing I think with that is that if you're a native speaker, and as you say, not a teacher or someone who's maybe more aware of language, when you try to simplify language, you often do it the wrong way. Native speakers tend to use more phrasal verbs because when we're speaking to each other, those are actually the more common words that you would use. But actually the longer, more complicated words are often the more international words. So actually speaking slightly more formally would actually make it easier for a non-native speaker to understand you, because they may have very similar words in their own language. So yes, we need to have another course, English for native speakers.
No, absolutely. It's true. Okay.
Well, a very good question. That wasn't a good question at all.
It's a very good question.
No, excellent question.
And as I mentioned, it's something that's experienced in every international company. People have this problem, and so it's definitely something to think about. Okay, we've run over a little, so I'm just going to take a couple more short questions, and then we'll move on. Going back to the length of CV, this is actually a very good question from Nihal Balba, because Nihal is saying, if you have 25 years of experience, I mean, is it okay if your CV is like 12 pages long? And that's a difficult question, because I have, experienced this myself, being an old man. It can be difficult to fit to really, the more experience you have, the recommendation is that your CV should never be more than 2 pages long. But it can be sometimes difficult to kind of put things into that. What would you say, David, for somebody like Nihal?
Well, I think if you've worked that long, it's probably a very good chance that what you did 25 years ago in your work experience is not that relevant to what you're doing now, and more importantly, what you're hoping to do when you're applying for the job. So I think basically I would probably put the last, 10 years maybe, which would immediately make it a lot shorter. You could actually have an appendix perhaps, so you could indicate these are, on the first 1 or 2 pages, you've got the key experience which you think is relevant to the job. But there's extra pages there just in case you want to check. Going back to what we said before, those can be ignored if necessary, because you've highlighted the key points.
So I think that's I think your point there is the important one. It comes for the cover letter as well, is to be selective, exactly. To be selective and focus on what's really going to get you the job, not on everything. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. We've got lots more countries joining us from Mongolia, Iran, Colombia, Portugal, lots of people there. Okay, I think we'll take one last question. Let me just choose a good one.
Tension mounts as Neil chooses.
Okay, hold on just 1 second. I'm sorry about this slight delay. It's a long question, so I just have to... Okay.
Got one?
This is a difficult question because the reason it's difficult is because I really don't know how to answer it. So
okay, go on.
I'm hoping that
one of us does. Yes.
One of you does. It's from Mamad Karim, and Mamad is asking about moving from one country to another. So changing countries with your job, and that every country perhaps has different expectations. For example, for CVs or cover letters or things like that, as well as experience and the kind of things that they want. And the question is, how can you adapt and explain the information? How can you deal with that change? So, for example, if you move from one country to a country with a completely different culture and expectations, and let's say we've given you guidelines for a standard CV or a standard cover letter, but the style in another country is maybe very different. What can you do? So as I said, I'm passing that over.
I think that's going to depend a lot on, as you said, it's on the country. And I think some countries, it's going to be easier to find that information about than others. If someone is emigrating, I'm going to make a presumption that they have already investigated different things about the country they're moving to. And they probably already know some places to look for that information. Perhaps there are clues in even just the way the adverts are put together. There might be, you mentioned social media before, Neil, and I think maybe there are, groups on things like Facebook where you can be in contact with other expats who are living in that country who might be able to give you advice what the format is. I mean, if you're thinking about countries like Britain and America, I think you'll find this a lot easier because there's so much information out there. It's just a question of looking for it, basically. There are other countries, I'll be honest, I would have no idea, and that my first step would be to try and find something like that.
Yeah, and so basically do research is what you're saying. Try to gather as much you can. Okay.
And there might be, I was just going to add that there might be somewhere you can go that could give you some advice, like some kind of citizens centre where you can ask for that kind of advice if you're new in a country.
And often when people emigrate, they're joining a community of people, from their own country as a starting point, and those people would be probably would know this type of information. So ask them.
Okay, we just have so many good questions coming in. I'm finding it difficult to stop.
I noticed.
Really, this is.
I'm not complaining. It's good. They're very good questions. Yeah.
The last two questions, I promise. Okay.
Last two now. Last two.
They're very short.
Was the last one we just did, but this the last two now. Yeah. Okay.
They're very short.
We won't check your mathematics skills. No.
This is related to the last question. That's why I wanted to ask it. Okay. It's from Lodis Marielle Hatcher, who's planning to move to the UK to work and doesn't have any experience in the UK, only experience in their own country. And they're just trying to think, how does that look? I mean, how can they, when they're applying for a job in the UK but have no experience in the UK and are coming from a different country, what can they do to make their CV, to show that they're able to transfer to a different environment like this? Any quick suggestions there for Lodis?
I think somebody who's moving from one country to another for work or whatever, just the fact that they're moving shows that they're a dynamic person who's prepared to make changes in their life where that's necessary, and that's something that you can talk about in your application or in your job interview.
So make it a selling point.
That you're dynamic and you've got enthusiasm for doing something new.
Yeah. So like I said, make that a selling point rather than a negative. The fact that I'm, okay. And the very last question.
And you're applying in English. That's a selling point. You're already showing you can speak English.
Yeah.
Okay. Very last question, because it's a very good one from Agnieszka Anna, who's saying, how do I write about gaps in my employment? Okay, so when there are gaps in my employment, how do I address these in my CV or cover letter? What would we say about that?
Well, I think it is important to mention, so that, because if you don't mention gap years, then it might just look like you didn't complete your CV properly. It might look incomplete. And I think, I mean, there are many different reasons why people may have a gap year. They might have gone off to study. Well, in that case, you can mention it as part of your education. If you're a parent, you might have taken time off to look after a child. I think that's worth mentioning, and worth mentioning skills you may have learned as a parent. You can turn that into a positive, because unfortunately it's often seen as a negative if people take time off for parenthood. And I think in general, that's the approach I would think of anyway.
Sally?
Yeah, just totally agree with what David said, basically. Yeah. And also just to make sure that you focus on the positive points of those gaps. I mean, you're still alive, you've still done stuff, you've still done things.
Yeah. And similarly, if there's a gap where perhaps the reason has not been a good one, or there's been a period where you've been out of work or something like that, prepare for it at the interview as well. Prepare for what you're going to talk about and stuff like that. Okay, that's really the last question. We have lots more, but we could be here all day if I carried on going. So thank you both for coming. And
the thing is, you would keep going, Neil. I know.
Yes. We will be back with another one of these later in the course, so I hope you look forward to that. And we'll be having some other events during the course as well to deal with that. So if you have any other questions, you can always post them on Facebook here. And of course, questions specifically about different steps on the course, ask them there, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Okay, you want to say goodbye, and then we'll call it a day.
Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.